How you doing, everybody? For Halloween reading, in the last few years, I've been going and looking into the classics of the horror genre. You know, I did Dracula one year, and then I did Frankenstein after that, and I did the Phantom of the Opera. Now, this book has been suggested to me relatively recently on my channel, but I can't seem to find where that comment went. But I have heard of it before, and thanks to some gift cards last Christmas from some friends of mine, I went ahead and got this, Guy Endor's Werewolf of Paris. And after reading this, I would probably recommend this book to anyone's shelf who's into that classic horror monsters on par with Dracula and Frankenstein and Phantom of the Opera and such. This was written in 1933, and you may think, wait, okay, that's kind of a bit too late from the classics, so it's early 1900s. But when you look about it, okay, you may have that, that's the right argument for that Victorian horror gothic that's from Frankenstein, which was published in 1818. But Dracula was written in 1897, just 3 years before 1900. Phantom of the Opera was 1910, and 1933, okay, you could probably put that in the tail end, but after reading this, I think this is probably something you want to put on par with that. So, let's take a look and, see if you can agree with me or not. Our story begins as an American student living in Paris doing his research, and while he's there, a friend of his, from America, comes by, visits him. He's the only person that she knows of, and she wants him to take him to all the, to nice, play. You go to Paris, you're young, you want to go to all the hot spots there. Reluctantly, he agrees. He takes her to a bar and all that. She's having a good time, dancing, flirting, and drinking and everything, and hooks up with a guy. And later, he is like, "Okay, you do your own thing." He's going and walks home first with a man he meets at a bar, talking about the wolf and all that. But eventually, when they separate, he meets a couple of guys, and they have these papers here that he is interested in. After negotiating to buy it, he finds out that this is the Galais report written by Aymar Galais, a man who wrote this in defense to a Sergeant Bertrand Calais, who was court-martialed during the Franco-Prussian War, and the events that happened in Paris at the time. He starts doing research on this, and that's where we get the main story from that. But before we start with the main story, he researches between two rival houses back in the Middle Ages, between the Pintamounts and the Pentavals. Two rival houses that got into very long, expensive war. At one point of the conflict, one of the Pintamounts infiltrated into the Pentavals' home under disguise as a monk, and during the middle of the night, and when everyone's asleep, he gets up and assassinates the lord and lady in the house. And before he does any more, he's eventually captured and is imprisoned in an oubliette. Yes, the oubliette. You may be familiar with that term from Labyrinth as a place to forget everything. Well, this was built for that purpose. They put him in an oubliette, and besides with the only access to a hole on the top giving him food, nobody, he has no interactions with anybody. He stays there for a long time, even to the point where when the rivalry between two families, just ends, he is eventually let go, but he's brought down to a incomprehensible, lunatic, primal state. This is a member of the Pentamounts, and this is going to leads into the events of the main story. We now jump ahead into the 1800s, where we're introduced to our main set of characters. One of the main ones is Aymar Galais, whose papers we're looking into in the court martial later on in the story. He's a man who was described as a pamphleteer. He's living with his well-off aunt, Mademoiselle Didier, and Josephine, who is a young orphan girl from Mademoiselle Didier's village, who she is raising, under her care. During a fierce thunderstorm, Didier was afraid that her house would get struck by lightning, and the only way she believes will prevent that is holy water to bless her house. She doesn't have any, so they send Josephine to Father Pentamount's church to get holy water. And unfortunately, as she enters in, all soaking wet, Father Pentamount, upon first meeting her, loses control, and long story short, she ends up bearing his child. Well, trying to trying to keep everything quiet, the father is, been moved around, and Josephine is under the care of Mademoiselle Didier and a few trusted people, to keep quiet. They tried to go through her pregnancy, and one of the things that Mademoiselle Didier is afraid of is that the child being born on Christmas. She is a very superstitious lady and believes that it is disrespectful for children to be born on Jesus's birth, the month of Jesus's birth. And she considers that a very bad sign of omen. And she tells how her family, people, her village tried to not conceive a child to where it could be born on there. Well, unfortunately, the child is. But, Didier does not realize that at first. Kept secret of that. So here we are. The child is born under the name Bertrand Calais. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing some of the French terms there. I'll just do what I can here. So, but I'm digressing again. And the child, is not it's not a very disruptive child. It is a kind of bit hairier on the arms and and hands, and has a bit of a unibrow. But other than that, it's a well-behaved child. Except at certain times when the aunt is ill, the child will start crying a bit. But then one day the child stopped on the day the aunt died. Well, Aymar, the nephew, is now the inheritor of her money, and he decides to move them all out to the country. So Aymar now sends Bertrand, his mother Josephine, and a housekeeper out into the country here, where they can grow up, and he can teach Bertrand his education. And Bertrand, growing up to be, despite his appearance, he was very healthy. He was strong, non-complaining, doesn't cry or anything. But unfortunately, he starts having these dreams where he's like an animal going out at night, running and hunting and everything. And then there's word of the village that their farm animals are being attacked and killed, to the point where the village sends out a hunter to try and track this down. They suspect a wolf, which is weird because there's been no wolf in that area in France for an incredibly long time. The hunter, tries to get a few shots, misses, and he thinks something's wrong, something is unusual about this wolf, to the point where he starts to take his wife's blessed silver cross, makes a bullet out of it, and shoots the beast, and he believes he's got him. Well, apparently he did, because Bertrand wakes up one night with a bullet wound in his leg. Aymar is makes the connections that lycanthropy may be involved. He does some research on the side, never tells never tells anybody his connection with what Bertrand is. But he tells Bertrand, okay, we're going to keep you locked up, for your safety at night, and while you recover, and we're going to keep doing this regularly. And of course, when he does that, all the attacks on the animals and all that stop. But eventually, the blame is placed on a ill-kept dog by a negligent farmer. So, but it stops. But all this stops for a while, And while Bertrand grows and studies with Aymar, Aymar is looking at it, is wondering what he's going to do with him, and figuring out what he is. After a while, Bertrand is now ready to take some placement exams for possibly for higher education and up in Paris and all that. Now, Aymar reluctantly agrees that he should probably go out on his own. Has no fits with the wolf lately, and so he thinks, okay, he lets Bertrand go out, take his placement in a larger town. And after a night, Bertrand's with a couple of his schoolmates. They go out into town. They go into this one building that a lady invites him in. They dance with some girls. The girls take him upstairs, and Bertrand, starts to, after getting too enticed by one of the ladies, he ends up waking up back home, not knowing how he got there. Aymar was wondering that himself, but then he's confronted by the lady of the house. Apparently, this is a very small brothel that one of the girls has been heavily attacked. She's still alive, but she's been wounded by him and wants reparations. After solving this, Aymar, not only confines him to his room, he also starts beating him to hope that, he never tells anybody his suspicions of what or what he found out what Bertrand is, but he beats Bertrand to hope the wolf stays in it, doesn't come out again. It comes, so it's now a very stressed relationship, to the point where Bertrand, with the help of his mother, escapes, runs away, and he runs off to Paris. During the course of his journey, he ends up killing one of his boyhood friends, and a very creepy scene, especially after he wakes up and finds his body. someone else gets to blame, of course. But one of the things that's funny is as he's, he runs off with, so much he doesn't have anything, but after killing his friends, he takes his food, takes his money, and even starts taking apart him. It just unconsciously, it was natural to take a piece of him to feed off of and everything, and almost stopping himself. So you'll see it as you read that part of the book. But he runs off to Paris, trying to live off there. Just now figuring out what Moorhead he is as he discovered over time. Aymar, sensing the danger, goes to Paris to try and find him. So Bertrand is now the werewolf of Paris. He's going around, he's wreaking havoc, upon attacks people, and even desecrates a few graves. One description of his attack involves a French general whose 5-year-old daughter died of an illness, and he's been making early morning trips to her grave to mourn, really early in the morning. In fact, he even hired the carriage driver, the funeral carriage driver, to take him there. And one early morning there, as he was the gates were open, he's led into the cemetery, and later his body was found, dead, along with the body of the grave of his daughter. It was desecrated around him. The carriage driver, who was against the rules of letting people in the cemetery and driving them there in the carriage, he's been put on trial and sent to blame on this because he figured he had a hand in killing him. He even found him with a pouch of money that was paid to him by the general. So, and there's other, attacks around the city, but why isn't Paris in an uproar on this? Because this is the Franco-Prussian War that's happening outside and happening in France, and is now coming to the Paris gates. Everyone's mind's on that, and so are the news reports. So Aymar trying to find Bertrand through news on the sides of such attacks that could attribute to him. He gets many false leads, but eventually finds Bertrand. Right before he does, though, Bertrand, hides out in the National Guard. That way he can make a little bit of money, and pay for his one room, which keeps everybody out because hidden there are scraps of remains of his victims here. But later he's as a soldier he's at this cantina, who is run by a beautiful Jewish heiress who does volunteer work for the soldiers, and he notices her, falls in love with her, but he notices that the beast is at bay. It doesn't come out. He believes that she's, that her presence cures him of that, and he tells her about it. He falls in love with her, and he, tells her about what she has done for him unknowingly, and eventually she reciprocates back in a sort of weird, dark. Some reviews call this a sadomasochistic kind of relationship. You'll see why when you read it. Of course, she gets someone in a relationship with him to the ire of another soldier who is trying to woo her and writes love letters to her, but she basically friend zones him. So friend zones him. Okay, sorry, mispronounced that. So anyway, Bertrand and Aymar finally meet up, and he they confront each other in a situation. He tries to convince Aymar that he found a woman that cures him, or at least so he thought. After they split apart, the beast starts to rouse up to him. He's afraid that's going to end up killing her. He doesn't want that, so he leaves her, and for a night he attacks a soldier, and that's what gets him court-martialed to during these events, and that brings out the Glaze reports. We come full circle where he is instead of being imprisoned or executed, he's sent into asylum, where we come to the end of the story. Now, just to let you know, you're expecting your werewolf stories to have a scene where you talks about the main character transforming into a wolf, and then go around wreaking havoc. You're in for a world of disappointment. You never read a scene where it directly talks about Bertrand's change from human to wolf form in any fashion. And this is going to be to the strengths of the story, that later you could be discussed about. But, this story kind of does not follow strictly into the tropes or what we expect werewolves to be. You know, where the wolf tends to come out at night, but not necessarily not the full moon at all. We just know it comes out at night and wreaks havoc, but not every night either. It seems to come whenever. There's an uncontrolled, there's an unpredictability behind that. Silver was used on Bertrand earlier, but it hasn't shown to it could have been just coincidence that it just hit his leg but didn't do any permanent damage for a while. Any bullet probably could have done it, but no one's ever shot him with it yet. So, again, if you're expecting the typical werewolf tropes there, you may be disappointed, but I would suggest to you to give this one a try and, see for its strengths in other ways. Of course, there's the things you could talk about this story in the literary discussions that we normally do with these type of stories. For instance, if we talk about Frankenstein between about man playing the role of God or negligent parenting and stuff like that, like Stephen Jay Gould would talk about that, or the sexual evils of Dracula and such. But this one book also deals with that, particularly of sex, but also of violence. But definitely when it comes to sex, usually about the inner beast of us all, that we lose control and become monsters ourselves. Again, because this werewolf is not typical, because it's not like genetically inherited in a sense, but it's like this, like taking the essence of evil that's in us all, you can pass that down or influence others like a disease. But in Bertrand, it's manifested in a werewolf form, but there's elements of all of us with that, and all that. When we see Aymar looking across, trying to hunt him down, and in his research, he, researching as far as the Pentamount murderer who was kept trapped and all that, and what happened with him, and then later, I don't know how he ended up having a child and all that. Somehow he has a descendant who became a priest, but when he meets Josephine, he loses control. Takes advantage of her and bears his child, which would later be Bertrand. But Aymar, while hunting Bertrand down, he comes across a group of scientists that, in a very dark eccentricities, has a dinner party. Aymar thinks this is a lead because he talks to one and he quietly says, "Hey, join us tonight." And he ends up, they have all these dishes of dogs and other animals we normally don't eat. And I think this is the way of the future to help feed the masses, so we don't have to worry about starvation. At one point, he thought that they actually caught Bertrand in a wolf form and tried to eat him. Okay, but that was a false alarm. Later, we talk about a church that the monks at the time have a dark secret about women that they kept there for a while, and of course the Franco-Prussian War, and when it comes to Paris, there was later a fight between the people of Versailles and the Communards, and the executions that were going back and forth that made the French Revolution look like a little tantrum, and how many people were executed between those sides. So, Aymar is looking at this and seeing this as the wolf in all of us in manifest forms, but strongly manifested in a very concentrated form in Bertrand. At least not as I worded here, but that's how I view about it. So again, this book carries it with it a wonderful way you could discuss it along with those other classics. So, and now, speaking of which, there's a very important scene to discuss as well. Again, as I said, it never says fully, directly a scene where Bertrand transforms into a wolf, but we're given all sorts of evidence to a point where Aymar is talking to a doctor who runs a mental asylum who's looking after Bertrand, and he's confronting him with his evidence, and he said, "Look, he asks the doctor, 'Have you seen Bertrand change?' The doctor says no. He says, "Why?" I don't need to see him change. I've done my research. I mean, the hair on his palms like that. There are people who have excessive hair growth. There are people born on Christmas around December of any time. Nothing happens to them. All these things can be explained rationally. And Aymar's saying that he brings out his evidence and what he thinks about it. So you have this conflict between the spiritual, because Aymar is becoming more and more spiritual. In fact, leaves for the priesthood as for his aunt's request, and of course the doctor who's in the age of enlightenment. So here they are seeing the same things, and interesting enough, there's either one of these could have spent time to hopefully make an observation of changing one form or another, but none of them do. So you're never given a direct, certain answer. But there is evidence of, at the end, especially with the appendix, plus whatever you got before, that says one towards the other. An interesting parallel I found is that can be discussed. Maybe to me, this may seem obvious to a lot of people, and again, this book can deal with lycanthropy as a sexual problem in a sense of how Aymar raises Bertrand. We see, here's a scenario. We know the story of parents who try to keep their kids from, being sexually promiscuous by keeping them ignorant about the facts of sex. And therefore, through that ignorance, they won't be going around, they won't be getting a woman pregnant, they will not, and by giving them lies and myths about being sexually promiscuous, that's supposed to keep them on the straight and narrow, so hopefully they would get married, and that's the only time they will do this, so they don't have to worry about this. There's an interesting parallel of scenarios like that, and between Aymar and Bertrand. Bertrand is kept ignorant of his lycanthropy, and is also kept his mother and the housekeepers and everyone else around him. Aymar keeps the lycanthropy to himself, which is understandable because lycanthropy is a myth at this point. This is the age of enlightenment and reason here. Lycanthropy is a myth of old folklore and all that, and that's an interesting thing. By keeping him, locked up and beating him without Bertrand's knowledge of what he is, he eventually causes him to run away, and the very thing he was afraid to happen actually does happen. So that's a wonderful parallel between those two scenarios of ignorance is used to try to keep them on straight and narrow, and eventually wrecks loose and brings havoc among people, to both Bertrand and to others. Oh, I almost forgot. In case this plot sound anything familiar with it, while we have countless movie adaptations of Dracula and Frankenstein and Phantom of the Opera, this has only been adapted once loosely by Hammer Horror Films in the 1961 film Curse of the Werewolf, starring the late Oliver Reed. The story behind that is, they took that book to make up for sets that they have set in Spain. The book takes place in France, of course, but they call it Curse of the Werewolf. They moved it to Spain because Hammer Horror Films was trying to make a movie involving the Spanish Inquisition, and they had sets built up in Spain, but they got in trouble with this, the Catholic Church in Spain, and of course with Hammer always in conflict with the censor board in England. They dropped the picture, but they still had the sets, so they took this story and loosely adapted it into Curse of the Werewolf. That's something you need to look into it. So I've watched part of it. I need to eventually watch down the way through. It follows loosely the beginning parts about a man being held captive for a long time, where he turns into a beast, and that nature is transferred into into Oliver Reed's character being the werewolf. So check it out if you haven't seen it. So there you have it. The Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore. This is a good book to keep, with your other books, along with the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein, Phantom of the Opera, that Victorian Gothic, creature stories. This one complements with it. Even though written in 1933, I think it just counts as the tail end of such stories that goes into the depths about this. And this covers the werewolf section of that. Now, I don't know of a one that deals with the mummy. Of course, we have Universal's Curse of the Mummy. I need to look into that, see if there's any good mummy fiction on that. So, with that said, I got this one at Barnes and Noble. And it was. I think this is one of the print on demand type books. So they couldn't order. I couldn't order it and have it sent to the store. I had them order it and send it directly to my home. Your store may vary. You may find a used one and all that. But it's something you should know. While this is not as well known as the others I've mentioned before of the classics, it is up to the culture to try and keep everybody informed, like with videos like this, and you pass it around and tell everybody, okay, yeah, your classic ones, yeah, got your Dracula, got Phantom, get this on there and add it to it. And I think we should, because we don't find too many werewolf literature along those lines, and this, I think, complements it perfectly. So, again, Werewolf of Paris by Guy Endore. Thank you all for watching. You have a nice day.